India is known as the Wonderland of the East because of its natural exuberance, pristine beauty and serenity. Aranyani was the Vedic goddess of trees. The concept of forest conservation is deeply rooted in Indian history and culture. In 321 BC itself, one finds the mention of the Department of Forestry in Arthashastra by Kautilya. Indians traditionally differentiated between natural forests Aranya and plantations Vana. In 305 BC, Megasthenes mentions three categories of forests in India: the reserve forests for rulers, forests for the public, and forests gifted to sages and priests. Around 250 BC, Emperor Ashoka's pillar edicts proclaimed rules for forest and wildlife conservation. Ancient Indians had understood the need of managing forest wealth even when resources had exceeded demand. Ironically, with the arrival of the British, Forest Conservancy was to start afresh, at a time when the demands had gradually started exceeding supply. Let us explore the interesting history of Forest Conservancy in modern India. Let us salute the forgotten person who was one of the pioneers of the modern forest service. The name of this legend is Dr. Alexander Gibson.
Our quest of Dr. Alexander Gibson was full of adventure. It included two aspects: Dr. Gibson as a person and Dr. Gibson as the first conservator of forests of India.
The British Empire, which was the supreme colonial power due to her strong navy, began to feel acute shortage of timber for shipbuilding. The British began to look beyond their frontiers for suitable timber. They initially thought forests in India to be inexhaustible. In 1806, East India Company appointed Captain Watson of Madras Police to harvest and export timber for shipbuilding. Under his command, timber exploitation continued till 1823. The post was abolished in 1823 by Sir Thomas Munro, the then governor of Madras.
In 1838, Lieutenant Williams, the controller of Bombay Dockyard, raised an alarm. He reported ships cannot be built in Bombay due to poor timber supply. At the same time, Mr. Blair reported from Malabar that for building one ship, 260 square miles of teak forest was required. Mr. Stebbing confirmed the bleak scenario and wrote that forest plundering had left hills bare, sterile and useless. Reacting with alacrity, the Bombay government acted and instructed Dr. Alexander Gibson, the then superintendent of Tarpuri Garden, to inspect the northern and southern Konkan forests, the present-day northern Western Ghats. After 2 years of surveys, in 1840, Dr. Alexander Gibson, in his detailed report, confirmed the worst fears of devastation and exhaustion of forests in Konkan. There was no timber for shipbuilding. Alexander Gibson was born in Scotland in the year 1800. His father, William, was a prosperous farmer. Alexander was baptized at St. Lawrence Church at Lawrence Kirk, Kincardineshire in Scotland.
Gibson was baptised here on the 24th of October 1800, and there's an interesting connection. The minister, the parish minister who baptised Alexander Gibson was someone called George Cook, who later became Professor of Philosophy at St Andrews University and was one of the teachers of Hugh Cleghorn, the first forest conservator of the Madras Presidency, so there's a nice link between the two early Forest Conservators of India.
Alexander Gibson's father, William, had 20 children from 3 wives. Alexander was the youngest child. After his father's death in 1808, Alexander was brought up by his elder sister, Catherine. He studied at Montrose Academy, which was a famous school at that time. Being naturally fond of languages, he excelled in Latin and Greek. Then he went on to the Marischal College and further to the University of Edinburgh. Subsequently, he entered the Royal College of Surgeons at Edinburgh, where he studied medicine, anatomy and materia medica, and continued studies in arts from Aberdeen. In 1820, having obtained his medical license, Dr. Gibson joined Dr. Thomas Hogg as surgeon's mate and sailed to India with the East Indiaman Royal George to Bombay and further to Singapore and Whampoa, and returned to England in 1822. In 1824, after his second visit to India, on the return voyage to England, Dr. Gibson had to perform an amputation of the leg of one William Hall, who was attacked by a shark. In 1825, Dr. Gibson sailed to Burma in the cruiser Discovery as a vaccinator and assistant surgeon with the East India Company. He received the Ava Medal at Ava in Burma, where he saved several lives as a flag surgeon. In 1827, he returned to India and joined the Bombay Horse Artillery and Bombay Native Infantry and negotiated with Bhils and successfully protected Madhuka forests in Gujarat and Rajputana. This was his first meaningful interaction with the Indian tribal community. Thus began his long and fruitful career in India. Dr. Gibson learned Hindustani, Marathi and Gujarati, and probably read the Maratha system of forest management, from which he later implemented a few principles. Interestingly, the Marathas had a system of forest conservation which was sadly neglected in later years.
My research has revealed that in 1653 AD, Shivaji Maharaj had created large plantations. Kanoji Angre, the admiral of Maratha Navy, he had also planted teak near Suvarnadurga in Konkan area for naval requirement.
One can see that the Marathas had undertaken timber plantations much before the celebrated Nilambur plantations by Mr. Connolly, the collector of Malabar in 1840. At this time, because of Dr. Alexander Gibson's knowledge of agriculture and botany, which he had acquired at Edinburgh from Daniel Rutherford, the scientist who, with Joseph Priestley, later discovered nitrogen. Dr. Gibson was also appointed as the superintendent of the botanical garden at Dapuri. He soon extended the botanical garden to Hivre in Junnar Valley. There, he experimented on food crops like tapioca, potato and sugarcane, which he was the first to introduce in the valley. Some huge trees like mahogany and banyan planted by Dr. Gibson still survive at Hivra. The mountain country at Junnar, where he was at peace, no doubt reminded him of his home in Scotland. Today, one can see a stone memorial there, constructed by Dr. Gibson for reasons unknown. Between 1841 and 1846, Dr. Gibson carved monuments for 3 pet dogs, Tipu, Hector and Lazy, in the Hivra garden. The 3 graves can be seen even today as a testimony of his love. At Hivre, Dr. Gibson and J.E. Stokes constructed a small dam which also has survived till date. Sadly, The Hivre garden that he loved so much has submerged in the backwaters of another dam. Dr. Gibson was a popular person at Hivre, not only because he communicated with the local people in the Marathi language, but also because he was a compassionate doctor. He gave them his valuable time, excellent medical advice, and free medicines. The local people respected and cared for him. In 1839, a noteworthy incident occurred in the life of Dr. Alexander Gibson. When at Hivre, a few dacoits attempted to rob his house at night. Interestingly, the local people came together to save him and drove the marauders away. This incident reveals that Dr. Gibson was well connected and immensely popular with the Rayat or people. Dr. Gibson had a strong constitution. He travelled extensively, often at night, for fear of mosquitoes and malaria, poisonous gases and miasma. He braved the threats of cholera and the risk of diarrhea in an era when there were no antibiotics. In the later part of his life, Dr. Gibson unfortunately suffered from the dreaded guinea worm infection that troubled him a lot. Dr. Gibson was an excellent horse rider, and his surveys on the horseback took him over the hills of the Deccan. He crossed streams and rode hundreds of miles to inspect and safeguard the state of Indian forests. He conducted field inspections in the summer and the winter. At Hivre, he wrote reports in the dim light of lanterns and candles during the wet months of the monsoon, when the forests became inaccessible and teemed with leeches, mosquitoes, and wild animals. In his report submitted in 1844, Gibson confirmed the overexploitation of forests. Dr. Gibson's reports were taken quite seriously by the Bombay government.
As a response to his report submitted in April 1844, the military board asked Dr. Gibson to submit a scheme for establishment of conservancy under his leadership. He immediately regulated timber felling to assure supply of firewood and timber. He requested a recognized status free of divided authority and submitted a proposal to this effect to the Government of India.
On 22nd March 1847, the Government of Bombay appointed Dr. Alexander Gibson as the Conservator of Forests of the Bombay Presidency.
Dr. Gibson exercised his personal judgment and discretion in forest management, which were those of a true visionary. Dr. Gibson had two offices, one at Surat in the north and the other at Sadashivgarh in the south. These places were very carefully chosen at harbours from where teak could be easily exported. Dr. Gibson obtained control over forest management by abolishing the then prevalent contract method of forest working. In 1841, he implemented silvicultural principles related to thinning and singling in Ratnagiri areas to improve the crop. As a result, during 1850s, these improved plots could provide wood for railway sleepers when the first railway started in Thane in Maharashtra. Dr. Gibson introduced the system of forest shares by entering into an agreement with the village khots, kamvizdars and patels. With this creative approach, the local people started protecting the teak forest that were once being plundered thoughtlessly. Thus, with the extraordinary vision of Dr. Gibson, the forests were led to move on a path of becoming people's forests.
Dr. Gibson regularly and periodically visited forests in Dangs, Bombay, Thane, Alibag, Ratnagiri, Sindhudurg, Belgaum, Sadashivgarh, Kolhapur, Satara, Pune and Ahmednagar. This is a huge area, and this was all done mainly on the horseback.
Dr. Gibson had realized that protection of forests had a considerable impact on soil erosion, irrigation and the climate. The need of a close collaboration between forest and water resources departments is quite obvious today.
In the perspective of Water Resource Department, forests are particularly beneficial as a means of preventing soil erosion and subsequent siltation in the reservoirs. See, it is still not late and we should learn from Dr. Gibson's thoughts. We should focus on afforestation of the hills around the reservoirs.
In 1828 at Dapari, John Malcolm, the first governor of Pune, set up the Dapari Garden, where Dr. Alexander Gibson was appointed a superintendent 10 years later. Remnants of the Dapari Garden survive today. Dr. Gibson had commissioned an unknown Dutch artist to draw the plants in the Dapari Garden between 1847 and 1850.
It all started off by the discovery of these 170 drawings in the illustrations collection here in the library, but these were scattered amongst 250,000 different sheets, all filed according to the name of the species. The characteristic thing about this collection was that the style, very bold style of the drawing, and each one of them had the words Botanic Gardens written on them, but nothing to say which botanic garden. But when I got them all together, just one out of the 170 has this annotation. So it says Vogelia rare, India, found by undersigned in 1835 Alexander Gibson.
Dr. Naughty, apart from the drawings that Dr. Gibson had commissioned when he was at Dapodi, he also raised a garden of living plants in Dapodi as well as in Hivra in the Junnar Taluka. Could you tell us something about the pharmacobotanical contributions of Dr. Gibson when he was in India?
The Dapuri one was mainly for exotic plants, which he imported from all over the world, but at Hivre it was mainly economic plants, both examples of his forest trees, but also medicinal plants. And one reason for this was that he was trying to grow medicinal plants that he could supply to the Bombay army, which would save on the import costs of expensive foreign medicines. Now I've got a couple here that we know that he grew at Hivre. One is a plant traditionally used in Indian medicine, the colocynth. The second one was really rather more exotic. This is something called the columba root, or in Latin, in materia medica, it was known as Radix columba.
Henry, I would like to draw your attention to a statement by Dr. Alexander Gibson from the garden report that he wrote in 1848. He writes, "I am of the opinion that the botanical department should mainly have in view the assembling of our tropical plants." Now, is it possible that Dr. Alexander Gibson, who was very much interested in exotic plants, actually also cared about the endemic plants and trees which were there in the northern and southern Konkan?
He specifically talks about introducing trees from our own forests, from the forests of the Western Ghats. because he says, in making this collection, I have also kept in view the probability of botanists from other countries desiring to explore our tree vegetation, but not having leisure to do so, except when it is in a collected form. And there then follows a list of 80 different species that he had brought into cultivation, presumably at Hivre, which includes many well-known Indian tree species, Dalbergia latifolia, which he says good wood, Hardwickia binata, Schreberus whitinoides, Dilenia speciosa, Michelia reedii, whole list of well-known timber trees. So yeah, he was interested.
Dr. Alexander Gibson had sent a few models of the contemporary Indian agricultural equipments to Scotland. These are carefully preserved at East Kilbride in the Museum of Rural Life, the National Museum of Scotland.
Yes, so these models, along with a number of other models, were given to the Royal Highland and Agricultural Society of Scotland. And from there they were put on display where they had a small museum in Edinburgh. After a number of years they were then given to the University of Edinburgh, and in the early 19th century a new museum of art and industry was set up again in Edinburgh, and they were given to that museum. And that museum is the forerunner to the National Museums of Scotland, which I work, and the National Museum of Rural Life, where the models are now housed, was opened in 2001. So we now display some of the model collection here in East Kilbride, and the rest of them are in open storage.
Dr. Alexander Gibson wrote The Bombay Flora and Forest Trees of India and edited a few books. He was in regular communication with Sir William Hooker, the then director of the Royal Botanical Gardens, Kew. His letters, written around 1858 from Shivneri Fort in Junnar, are preserved at Kew.
These letters are some of our only source of biographical information for some of these individuals who write to Kew. Part of the reason why this collection is so important is because of in Alexander Gibson's case, this is the only place that you have been able to locate any correspondence from Alexander Gibson. And that's probably true of many individuals, particularly with regard to their travels around the world. But we are very fortunate that we still have this collection and that it has been looked after for over 150 years.
Dr. Alexander Gibson had interacted with Sir Dietrich Brandis, who was a German botanist and the first Inspector General of the Forests of India. Brandis appreciated and supported him. Dr. Gibson collected new plants, and his name is immortalized through 11 species of plants, which were named by his colleagues DL, Stokes, Kurz, Graham and Hooker. Some of these plants are Bellaria gibsoni, Croton gibsonianus, Indigofera gibsoni and others. Dr. Gibson received several other honours as well.
We are now in the prestigious Linnean Society of London, which was founded by James Edward Smith in 1788. The fellowship of the Linnean Society is considered to be an honour.
Well, the extraordinary thing, because the records are all kept here, it was a very formal process.
Yes.
You had to be proposed, and then there was a ballot held. It's a formal statement, but it is meant. It says, Dr. Alexander Gibson of the Bombay Medical Service, a gentleman attached to the pursuit of natural science, and especially of botany, being desirous of becoming a Fellow of the Linnean Society of London, we, the undersigned, do hereby recommend him as highly deserving of that honour and likely to become a valuable member. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people who knew him have signed that statement.
In 1858, Dr. Gibson inherited the ancestral house at Auchenrioch. He was promoted as Surgeon Major in 1860. However, in 1864, he finally left India and returned to Auchenrioch in Scotland.
One living testimony to Gibson's time here are these three magnificent giant redwood trees, almost certainly planted by him at the very end of his life. Given that his great interest when he was in India was in forestry, he carried that out in practice after he retired, and he planted lots of new trees on particularly the next door estate of Chapelton. And when he left his will, he said that whoever inherited it would forfeit the estate if they chopped the trees down. So it was an extraordinary continuation of his interest in forest preservation.
It is generally perceived in India that Dr. Alexander Gibson's grave is at Hivra in the premises of the botanical garden there. Dr. Henry Nolte's research has brought us to the cemetery of the Stracathro Church in Angus County in North Scotland.
He died on the 16th of January in 1867, and his sister must have added the last part of the inscription. So it says also of the said Alexander Gibson, who died at Auchenrioch the 16th of January 1867, aged 67 years.
Sadly, we do not have a single photograph of Dr. Alexander Gibson. He laid firm foundations of scientific and participatory forestry as well as economic and pharmacobotany in India. Dr. Gibson's life shows how selfless dedicated service augments the natural wealth and knowledge domains of two great nations, United Kingdom and India. This Scottish surgeon and the first conservator of India's forests passed away incognito. His legacy, however, lives on in the forests of India that he loved and protected with a singular dedication. The indomitable spirit and commitment of Dr. Alexander Gibson to forestry will continue to inspire future generations of Indian foresters and all conservation-oriented minds of the world.